Let's make us a breach in the enemy lines. The Vindicator's Demolisher Cannon has had a bit of a tune-up from the Tech Marines, so let's see just what this big bag gun can do. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where we're continuing Tank Week. We're going to be looking at every single Space Marines unit in the new Codex that has treads. We've taken a look at the Hunter and Stalker over the previous days, and now we're on to the Vindicator. In this video we'll take a look at the Vindicator's new rules, any combos and buffs we can give it on the tabletop, then we'll talk about a few tips and tricks for using him when you're actually playing a game. Now, the Vindicator is an absolutely iconic tank of the Space Marines, going back a long way. I had one of the old versions of this model, and I think that the new version looked absolutely epic when it came out. I own one myself, and it's been sitting on the shelf for the vast majority of 8th edition, but it's been getting some games in since the new Codex. Vindicators are some of the Adept Society's siege tanks, lumbering forward with a hefty reinforced siege shield, ready to get that Demolisher Cannon in range to do some serious damage to the most valuable fortifications and units in the enemy army. The Vindicator is a heavy support choice for Codex Space Marines, and weighs in at 125 points with no upgrades. It has an identical profile to the Hunter and Stalker we've just reviewed, with a movement of 10 inches when it's got 4 wounds, weapon skill 6 up, ballistic skill 3 up, strength 6, toughness 8, 11 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 8, and a 3 up save. When it degrades, which is when it's 5 wounds or less, its movement drops to 5 inches and its ballistic skill to 4+, and when it has only 2 wounds or less, it has a movement of 3 and a ballistic skill of 5 up. Unupgraded, it is armed with only the Demolisher Cannon, a 24-inch heavy D6, strength 10, AP -3, D6 damage shot. Now, the big change from this compared with the Index is that it used to be D3 against big targets such as vehicles or monsters. It's now gone to heavy D6, so that's almost a double damage increase. I think this buff was definitely needed, as it just wasn't competing with the other armor options Codex Space Marines had available. The Demolisher Cannon certainly packs a punch. With no buffs or any other benefits coming from outside of itself, it will on average put 4.5 wounds on your standard tank, so anything that's toughness 7 or 8 with a 3 up armor save. As a heavy weapon, it will love being in the Devastator doctrine, and that will upgrade it to strength 10 AP -4 shots, which will mean that your standard 3 up save tank won't get an armor save at all. It has a couple of options characteristic of most Space Marine tanks. It can take a Hunter Killer missile, and it can be equipped with a Storm Bolter as well. I'd pretty much always take the Storm Bolter, particularly as this is going to be the sort of tank you want to be advancing towards the enemy to get in range for its Demolisher Cannon. And unless you've got any way of augmenting the firepower, I would typically leave the Hunter Killer missile at home, as you'll often be wanting to move the tank, therefore the Hunter Killer missile will only be hitting on 4+, so it's a lot less valuable than taking a Hunter Killer missile on other vehicles. It has the Angels of Death rule, which is most notable for giving the Storm Bolter the Bolter Discipline rule, and also allows the tank to access the combat doctrines to give the Demolisher Cannon an AP -4 when in Devastator Doctrine. When it's destroyed, on a 6 it explodes, and every unit within 6 inches suffers D3 mortal wounds. And it also has smoke launchers, which can be a useful thing on this tank, because it's so short ranged you might often find that it can't shoot any significant enemy unit, so you should seriously consider popping smoke any turn that it isn't able to fire its Demolisher Cannon. So all in all, it's a tank that wants to start fairly close to the enemy and advance towards them to get its Demolisher Cannon in range of a hard target and unleash a nasty amount of firepower. It's got a fairly good damage output for its points cost and a pretty decent durability too, and its main drawback is its short range. So let's take a quick look at any buffs and combos we can give to the Vindicator. As with any vehicle, Iron Hands is a great pick for this tank, particularly because of the Super Doctrine, the Calculated Fury, will allow it to move and fire with no hit penalty. Vindicators are particularly going to be wanting to move towards the enemy each turn, because they may well be out of range with their main gun, so having a rule that completely nullifies this penalty is absolutely great. Iron Hands are also pretty awesome for the 6 up Feel No Pain, slower degrading, boosted Overwatch, and reroll ones to hit with their Super Doctrine. Ultramarines is another good shout for a Vindicator due to the same rule applying in their Tactical Doctrine, where it can move and shoot as if it were stationary. Also, as it's quite close ranged, it's more vulnerable than most tanks to being tagged in close combat, so Ultramarines will allow you to fall back and shoot normally. Salamanders or Master Artisans is another awesome choice due to the Vindicator having a small amount of very high quality shots, and you should be able to reroll 1 hit and wound per turn to give it a massive boost to firepower. And finally, Raven Guard or Stealthy can give it a 2-up save when the opponent is greater than 12 inches away from this tank. I strongly suspect that the Imperial or Crimson Fist Super Doctrine will give this a buff as well, but we'll have to wait to find out until the Codex drops. Vindicators benefit in the usual way from having captains and lieutenants around to buff its damage, and I could easily see a Vindicator being part of an advancing castle of Space Marines characters and vehicles heading towards the foe to unleash some close range firepower. As it's going quite close to the foe, it's likely to be taking more damage than other vehicles, so having a Tech Priest or Iron Father Phyros of the Iron Hands is certainly a very good idea too, to fix your tank back up to full potential. If you are playing Iron Hands, it's certainly worth having the Ironstone about if you're not using it elsewhere in your list. As I said, this tank is likely to take damage, so anything that improves its survivability is great. There are a few stratagems to bear in mind with the Vindicator, as it could be at the forefront of your army. Armour of Contempt to ignore mortal wounds and a 5-up could save it from taking a bunch of mortal wounds due to smite. Big Guns Never Tire is certainly an option, as it can let you ignore the penalty for moving and shooting for 1 turn. Bear in mind that this is only a 33% damage buff and will likely only cause an extra wound or 2 to whichever vehicle that you're firing at, so personally I would probably just fire it, take the hit penalty and spend my CP elsewhere. Finally, I would certainly consider using a command point reroll on the number of shots if you roll a 1 for the number of shots on the Demolisher Cannon. On average, using a command reroll if you roll a 1 will net you an extra 3 damage against your target after you've worked all the maths out, so that's a lot better value if you are thinking of spending a CP to buff this guy. So how would I build my Space Marine Vindicator then? As I said, I would take the Stormbolter. I'd usually leave off the Hunter-Killer Missile unless I am using Master Artisans or Salamanders, and I want to start him somewhere towards the front of my deployment zone, ideally screened by my own infantry units. I'd want to advance the Vindicator towards the enemy, but I'd have to bear in mind the likelihood of being charged by other enemy advancing units. It'd be a close run thing between, do you want to put it so close that it can fire at better targets, or do you want to keep it safer from being tagged in close combat and made useless for a turn? I think I'd happily run 1 Vindicator. I'm not sure I'd go for the full 3 that you could use, as if you're fielding a lot of that, the enemy might just step a fair bit back and outrange the lot of them. If you're running just 1, then it's certainly possible the enemy might just focus a lot of firepower on that 1 first turn, but that isn't so bad in my mind. Even if it goes down, then you've made the enemy focus all of their firepower on 1 very tough to kill model, and if it leaves the rest of your army unscathed, then that's certainly a positive. I'd personally choose either Iron Hands or Ultramarines to run this Vindicator due to the ability to move and shoot without penalty. Overall, I'd say the Vindicator is a moderately competitive unit. It certainly has a whole ton of damage potential, and it forces the enemy to make some tricky decisions with target priority and their movement. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to see as much play in competitive lists compared with some of the other Space Marines options. It's just not quite as strong against infantry targets, and it might well be out of range of any decent tank targets, particularly if your opponent decides to set up all of his tanks as far back on the battlefield as possible and just shoot you from out of your range. I can't see myself including one in one of my most competitive lists, but that's probably more a sign of the Space Marines having so many good options rather than the Vindicator being bad per se. I've certainly been having a lot of fun using it in more casual games. So that wraps up our review of the Space Marine Vindicator. In Tank Week tomorrow we'll be looking at the Predator, the standard battle line tank of the Space Marines. I'd very much like to hear it if your Vindicators have been seeing any success on the tabletop. The Demolisher Cannon certainly has a massive potential to do crazy amounts of damage in one shot if you roll very well. Thanks for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. Feel free to subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next video.